We are a little bit blendy today. It is mostly Alex dealing with a lot of sensory overload recently. So we've got these big noise canceling headphones on, and hopefully they won't pick up too much background noise because maybe it's just a sensory overload, but it sounds like everything outside is so loud. So we'll see how it goes. Today we're going to be talking about system roles. And this is something we've been asked to talk about a lot, and we think that maybe we'll give a kind of unique perspective on it because we don't like system roles. We don't like using them. So likely most of this video is going to be us saying, yeah, I guess this is what this is, but we think that it's just, you shouldn't listen to it. So let's go. Okay. So I'm just gonna go down a list because we don't really use system roles. I can't just really fire them off because we kind of intentionally stay away from them. So I just looked up a list of common system roles, and I'm just gonna talk about them. I think it's just in this list, they're alphabetical. So let's get started. There is an animal alter. I'm gonna kind of go away from just thinking animal alter, and let's just talk about non-human alters. And this is a good way to start it, I think, because it's good to understand right off the bat that alters can be anything. Alters can be animals, alters can be mythological creatures, and alters can be inanimate objects. It's whatever the person's brain at that moment in time when they were enduring trauma thought that maybe this thing could survive this. I can't. I need something else to handle this for me. What could survive this? We always use the example of if you're being held underwater, you might develop a fish alter if you thought you were going to drown. But that's not so much a system role as a classification. That's also just something that we don't love about the whole thing with system roles, because so much of it gets muddy between what's the alter's job and who the alter is. People often will say that being a little is a system role, and no, that just is explaining the age of the alter. So anyways. Okay. Persecutors. Persecutors, we really think that this term needs to be thrown out. Unless if people identify with it, specifically the alter who's being called a persecutor identifies with it, that's okay. But persecutor alters are generally alters who hold a lot of trauma, and generally the rest of the system won't necessarily know what that trauma is, and definitely doesn't know what it's like to be the one holding it. And because of being through so much trauma, this alter may have developed unhealthy coping mechanisms that end up harming the body, or cutting off ties with people around them because they don't trust that those people aren't going to end up hurting them. So essentially they end up doing things that the system views as very negative. It also can get to the point of, by the way, there are going to be just many trigger warnings throughout this, so just be aware as you're watching this. I'm going to censor it, but topics will be brought up. Persecutor alters may harm the body. They may get to the point of feeling okay, the best way to protect this body is to remove it from the world because the world isn't a safe space. All alters are there to protect the body. A lot of people will call persecutors misguided protectors. Even that we don't really like, because that's using our own judgments of what's right and wrong and putting that on them. But yeah, persecutors are just people who have developed unhealthy coping mechanisms, and that's okay. And they generally, systems will fall into the trap of trying to push them away and control them instead of working with them and trying to help them heal. And persecutors, a lot of the systems that we know, some of the most core people in their system who are the most positive used to be persecutors and were accepted by their system and were helped by their system. And once it wasn't working against each other but working with each other, they stopped doing unhealthy things to the body. Here's another one, like this says baby and infant alters. That's not a system role. That's just a classification. That's just an alter who is stuck in infancy age and infancy mental processing states. Caretakers or soothers, internal self-helpers, none of these are like, these are all just kind of community terms usually. So there are a lot of different versions that people use for whatever feels right for that alter. But generally caretakers will be a little bit more internal, especially if it's an internal self-helper, then they will often be fully internal. And they're the ones that are kind of there to help the system internally, to take care of people, to make sure that everyone's okay. Some people even kind of have it structured so they have like therapists internally, and their caretakers basically act like therapists. A lot of we've been dissociating a lot today. A lot of systems will have specific caretakers who care for the littles in the system. Child alters and littles, again, that's not a system role. There can be littles who have other roles. That's just who they are. And littles are generally anywhere from like 3 to like between like 8 and 10. It kind of depends on the little's maturity if they start being considered a middle. We consider a middles from like 11 to 13, but maybe even to 14 or 15. There's not really a clear cutoff for that. Sorry, I'm trying to just not dissociate into nothingness. Yeah, so little is also something that's interesting to remember, is like you need to have the care that you have with a child. Littles have the processing mind of a child. That being said, like our youngest little is 4 years old, and she's been with us our entire life. So she's a 4-year-old with 22 years of life experience. So while she has the processing mind of a child and you still need to have that kind of care with her, she also has tons of skills that your average 4-year-old wouldn't have. She can drive, she can cook, she can have more complex conversations and everything. But understanding that just because there's a little who is like 6 years old doesn't mean that they are confined to the abilities of a 6-year-old. If they've been alive for the system's whole life, they can be much more adult than the adults in your system. But that doesn't discount the fact that they are still a child. So then this one has the core or the original. There's a lot of debate right now on cores and originals, especially we strongly believe in the theory of structural dissociation. We talked about that in one of our previous videos describing DID and how it works. We kind of think that there is a middle ground, and the two try and exist in a way that is like it's one or the other, and we don't necessarily think it is that way. We think so that with structural dissociation, because there are systems that identify with having a core, and that's totally valid. And how we kind of view it is there's structural dissociation. Please go watch that video if you would like. There's a visual and everything if you don't know what structural dissociation is. But basically, everyone starts with these different ego states, and then most people, before like 7 to 9, those all integrate to one, and you're one person. And those aren't alters, those are ego states that if trauma happens can become alters. And so what we kind of view is people who identify really strongly with the core may have had that integration process start before their trauma happened to interrupt it. So let's say there were like 7 ego states, and like 5 of them, or even 6 of them, had already integrated, and that last 1 or 2 hadn't, and then they had their trauma. And so because all of those ego states had formed into one, and those aren't alters, that's not an integration in that way, that is what would have been a singlet. That's kind of how we view, if a system really strongly identifies with a core, how that and structural dissociation don't have to be mutually exclusive, if that makes sense. If you're not already pretty educated on core theory and structural dissociation theory, that probably will just sound like a big jumble of words that doesn't make sense. But okay, dead alters or ghost alters. Many systems have these. It is usually an alter. Again, this is like who the alter is, not necessarily what their role is. But we like to call them ghost alters because dead alter just feels weird. But it's up to each alter individually and their system. So ghost alters generally are created when the body thought that what it was going through had gotten to the point where they had died or were about to die. Demonic alters and like evil alters a lot of the times will come from religious trauma, and again, that's just what an alter is, not necessarily their role. A lot of these I'm kind of confused why they're on this list, but yes, there are a lot of people who will have demonic alters, generally from religious abuse and religious trauma. And that falls into the category of non-human alters. Disabled alters, again, don't love that. We did look through this and we were like, okay, categorizes everything, but we knew we were going to have issues with some of how this was said. And that's kind of why we wanted to talk about it, because it's important to bring up the issues with how people talk about DID. But yes, alters, there have been tons of studies. Different alters access different parts of the brain. And there are possibilities for there to be alters who cannot access certain parts of the brain, that leaves them with certain disabilities or just different physical reactions to things that the others don't have. So there can be alters who are completely blind in a body where all the other alters can see perfectly. There have been alters who have really severe allergic reactions to things that the other alters in their system don't. There are many mute alters. Yeah. And mute alters, you can kind of assume where that comes from. That's not necessarily always so much from not accessing part of the brain, but usually it is from being told that you had to be quiet, and being forced to be quiet and be held down that way. And that will often split a mute alter. Not often, but if you're a system and you have a mute alter, that's often why. We've talked before about interjects and fictives, like factives and fictives. So interjects is just an alter who, when they were forming, they have the role that they need to like fill, I guess. And sometimes the personality that forms around that gets pulled from a source that body has experienced. So whether that's a factive just means someone who does or has existed. So it could be a historical figure, it could be a politician, it could be a celebrity, it could be your cousin, or like your teacher at school. So if that person has qualities that is what the body needs at that moment to split, it could split an alter who looks, sounds, has the same name as something. And sometimes it'll be like from a book source and they'll have similar memories. And sometimes it'll just be like they're kind of similar, but they took the name. So fictives and factives come at different degrees of how fully they identify with their source also. And again, that's just who the altar is. That's not actually a system role. I guess this could have been called like types of altars, but again, we hate all of the stuff surrounding this kind of categorization of altars in D&D. And we'll talk more at the end about why we hate all of it. And throughout. Fragments. We also hate like using that term, and we personally have never, and I don't think will ever, categorize any altar in our system as a fragment. Fragments tend to be viewed as incomplete altars, where basically it's like they're stuck in one emotion, they really run one thing, they maybe are stuck in a trauma memory. But even if that's the case, they are, or at least have the potential to be, a full rounded person, and trying to pigeonhole them into you're just a fragment who just is like not a full person is like gross. And sorry if you identify with fragments and you're someone who has fragments in your system, that's fine. We just feel gross about it. Gatekeepers. Gatekeepers are essentially, we kind of view them as the managers of the system, and they often are altars who have a better level of control over who fronts when, pushing people to the front, pulling people away from the front, and or kind of assigning memories and who gets access to what memories. So like if you're in a situation where like if you're in a situation where you wouldn't want a little to front and a little suddenly was getting really pulled to the front, the gatekeeper might be able to stop that from happening. And like if someone learned a memory, if someone brought something up to the host who wasn't supposed to know about that trauma that they went through, the gatekeeper might take that memory away. Do you need to get off the couch, Cora? Go ahead. Go. Okay. The host is just the person who spends the most time fronting in the body, who handles the most day-to-day stuff. The host role can change over time. We've talked about that also in the past. The host is not the original, or at least does not have to be, depending on whether or not you believe in core theory and all that. And yeah, we have had at least I'm at least our fourth host. We think that there may have been a fifth host, and we don't know who they were, but we think that we're a little bit confused about the ages of like 8-ish to like 14-ish. 13, no wait, like maybe 8 to 12 or 13, I don't know. Insiders, I haven't actually heard this term used very commonly, but it just essentially is altars who don't front a lot and just spend their time internally. Internal self-helpers, similar to caretakers, spend their time internally, intentionally to care for the system. We have someone like that who I don't actually know if she's ever fronted, but she is our first like really, it seems pretty clear that she's an internal self-helper, but again, we're never going to say that that's who she is or what she is, because we don't like system roles. Opposite sex altars, again, that's just like, that's just getting into like unnecessary gender stuff, especially like if someone identifies as non-binary or whatever, like, I don't know. And B, that's not a system role, that's just who they are. But yes, altars can be totally different from the body. Protectors, we also don't love that term, even though it's like a more positive term than like persecutor or something. our issue with the term protector is that every altar in a system is a protector. Every altar exists. Cora, do you want to come up? Come on. Come up and lay down so you can be a little quieter. Thank you. Can you lay down? Good. No, we're not doing that right now. There we go. Okay, so the reason we don't like protectors is we love protectors, but essentially all altars are formed out of the body and the system needing something to protect the body. Every altar is a protector in just a different way. So we don't love using protector as a defining term because we feel like that just implies that some altars aren't protectors, and that's not the case. Sexual altars are just altars who... There's a difference between a sexual altar and a sexual protector. A sexual altar is just a person who's sexual. A sexual protector is someone who has had to generally, not always, but generally, be the one to front and hold the memories of non-consensual sex, which is not sex. I just think that YouTube won't let me say the word. Shell altars, there's a big debate on whether or not they're a thing, and we haven't actually heard that term used very much recently. But from what we gather and how we've heard it used before, is essentially like altars who... Also, sorry if my dog's being loud. Altars who don't have very much of a sense of self, but essentially are usually kind of the filter, so that all the other altars don't actually fully front usually and will just strongly influence, and the shell altar is just kind of whoever translates that out into speech and into actions. Many people don't really believe that shell altars are a thing. I don't really know. I also could be explaining that wrong, so don't take my word for that one. Yeah, there's teen altars, there's middles who are like in that preteen area. Yeah, that's about it. Cora, can you stop right now? Thank you. Now it's just right before bath time. You can do bath time later, but it sounds kind of gross. There we go. I don't know if you guys can hear it or not. She just can be very loud, and because these are noise canceling, I don't know. I can't hear, and I don't know what they're picking up. Anyways. Yes, so why we don't like system roles. We don't like system roles because each altar is their own full person. That's it. You shouldn't have to be tied to any one specific role, and especially before you discover your system, it's likely that everyone has been really stuck in one specific role and has been like not allowing themselves to be a full person. And so our main goal right now is to allow all of us to really fully explore who we are as people and allow ourselves to live as full, unique lives as we can individually. And that's really hard to do when you're constantly like, yes, this is my role, this was what I was made to do, this is my thing. And like, it's okay for that to not be your thing. It's okay to just be a person, and maybe you have some skills and maybe you have some tendencies, but like imagine if you're a singlet out there, imagine if your entire life have just been told, oh yeah, well, it's your job to like know about trauma, and that was something that wasn't even in there, was trauma holders. Trauma holders are altars who hang on to trauma, or who hold on to the trauma memories and don't share them with others so that the rest of the system stays safe from those memories. But it just never, like, no one's ever going through their lives, I mean, definitely in little ways, but never in such an overt way of like just hearing from the very beginning, you are a caretaker. Your job is to care for other people when they're falling apart. That's it. Why aren't you handling that? You're the caretaker. Anyways, we don't like system roles. We think they're very limiting. We think they feel like something that was created by people who were very much on the outside of DID and were like studying people with DID but not actually talking to them, and not by any systems themselves, and they were like trying to categorize people and make it make sense without just accepting the fact that just alters are people. Yeah. Anywho, that's that. Thank you guys. System roles.